The evening air in Maplewood Oaks was crisp as Sarah stepped out of her new house for the first time, the weight of years of military service and trauma hanging heavy on her shoulders. With each step, her golden retriever, Max, trotted beside her, his gentle eyes constantly scanning, always aware. Sarah had hoped that this would be the fresh start she needed, away from the chaos, away from the noise. She was a decorated Navy veteran, her service and sacrifice etched into her being, but this neighborhood felt different. Too perfect, too pristine. Max wore his service vest, a subtle yet undeniable signal that he wasn't just a dog. He was her lifeline. In the years since her deployment, Max had become the bridge between Sarah and the outside world, the steady anchor when her mind began to spiral. His presence calmed the storms in her head that no one could see. He was her rock in an ocean of chaos. But as Sarah passed the manicured lawns of her new neighbors, she noticed the stares. Not the usual friendly greetings she'd come to expect, but eyes that lingered too long. Whispers behind curtains, subtle but unmistakable. Sarah tightened her grip on Max's leash and walked on, her military instincts telling her something was off. It wasn't the neighborhood. It was the people. As they approached the cul-de-sac center, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Standing at the edge of her lawn, hands on her hips and a look of pure disdain etched across her face, was Karen. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA Queen Bee, the self-appointed ruler of Maplewood Oaks. Her name alone was enough to send a chill through anyone in the subdivision. Karen had earned her reputation through countless complaints and a near-obsessive need to micromanage every detail of the neighborhood. A woman who believed the rules existed solely for others. But as Sarah had quickly learned, Karen didn't like outsiders, especially ones with a dog that didn't fit the mold. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice sharp and overly authoritative. "Is that your dog?" Sarah stopped, trying to keep the conversation civil. "Yes, his name is Max. He's a service animal." Karen's lip curled into a smug smile, her eyes narrowing at the service vest. "I don't think that's legal here. We don't allow pets over 20 pounds, and that dog looks like a dangerous breed." Max, sensing the tension, stood still, his posture calm but protective. Sarah's grip on his leash tightened slightly. "I assure you," Sarah replied, her voice steady, but a flicker of warning in her eyes, "Max is a trained service dog. He's registered under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Karen took a step closer, her eyes scanning Max with disdain, as though she could somehow decide what was or wasn't legal just by looking. "Well, I don't care about your little laws. We have rules here, and I'm sure your service dog isn't welcome." Sarah clenched her fists at her sides, trying to keep her cool. This wasn't the first time she dealt with ignorance, but something about Karen's attitude made her blood boil. "I suggest you check with the HOA before making assumptions," Sarah said, her voice low, controlled. "Max is allowed to be here, and if you continue to make accusations, I'll have to take further action." For a moment, Karen hesitated, taken aback by Sarah's calm response. But then, with a dismissive flick of her hand, she turned on her heel, muttering, "You'll regret this." As Karen walked away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Max gave a soft woof, as if sensing the same thing. The quiet cul-de-sac that Sarah had hoped would be her sanctuary now seemed like a battleground, and the woman who called the shots had just made her first move. Sarah sighed, exhaling a long breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The fight was coming. And this time, she wasn't going to back down. Not for herself. And certainly not for Max. The next morning, Sarah opened her door to a crisp breeze and the faint scent of freshly cut grass. The neighborhood was still, the kind of quiet that should have been comforting. But Sarah knew better. She had been trained for tension, for reading the fine details, every rustle in the trees, every shift in the air. Something felt off. Max, ever alert, was already at her side, his tail twitching as his nose pointed toward the cul-de-sac. He knew it too. She stepped outside, glancing around the block, and then her eyes landed on the familiar figure of Karen, standing with a clipboard at the end of her driveway. The HOA leader was already surveying the neighborhood with a scrutinizing eye, her expression one of quiet satisfaction as she jotted something down. Sarah's stomach tightened. Karen had been watching. "Good morning," Sarah called out, trying to sound friendly, but her voice carried a quiet edge. She could feel the weight of what was coming next. "Oh, it's you," Karen replied, her voice dripping with condescension. She didn't even glance at Max. "I've been reviewing some neighborhood guidelines, and I noticed something troubling." She gave Sarah a pointed look, her lips curling just slightly. "I don't believe your dog is allowed in our neighborhood. The HOA clearly states no pets over 20 pounds. Sarah's chest tightened as she forced a smile. "Karen, I've already told you. Max is a service dog. He's protected under federal law." "Service dog?" Karen snorted, her eyes narrowing. "I'm sure that's a convenient excuse for you, but I've had complaints. The neighbors are talking. There are rules here, and I intend to see them followed." Sarah's patience was beginning to thin. "Max is trained. He helps me with my PTSD, and he is allowed here." Karen raised a hand, cutting her off. "Well, we'll see about that." She straightened up, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous determination. "I've already contacted animal control. They'll be by to assess the situation." Before Sarah could respond, Karen turned sharply on her heel and stalked off toward her house, muttering under her breath, "I'm going to make sure the rules are followed." Sarah stood still, her heart pounding. Her blood pressure was rising, and she could feel her hands begin to shake. She looked down at Max, who was calm but alert, his head tilting to the side as if he, too, understood that something wasn't right. She had anticipated pushback. But this was an outright attack. Without wasting time, Sarah pulled out her phone and checked the footage from her security cameras. It had been recording the entire conversation, every word, every look. She was going to need that footage when animal control arrived. She wasn't going to let Karen's spiteful actions slide. But as Sarah stood there, something gnawed at her. This wasn't just about Max. It wasn't even about the HOA rules. There was something personal in Karen's eyes, something deeply malicious that didn't just want to enforce rules but wanted to break Sarah. This was a game of power, and Sarah had unwittingly stepped right into the crosshairs. Max nudged her hand, bringing her back to the present. "We've got this, boy," she whispered, squaring her shoulders. "Let's see how far she wants to take it." Unseen by Sarah, Karen was already inside her house, grinning like a cat that had caught a mouse. And in her mind, the game had only just begun. Days passed, but the tension in Maplewood Oaks only grew. The peaceful suburban streets that had once seemed like the ideal place for Sarah to start fresh now felt like a pressure cooker, simmering with hostility. Every time Sarah walked Max, her eyes would dart from house to house, feeling the heavy weight of unseen eyes watching her. It wasn't just the occasional glance. There was something deliberate, something darker in the way the neighbors seemed to avoid her, as if they were silently waiting for her to slip up. Max sensed it too. His usual calm was replaced with an unusual alertness. He would grow still at the slightest noise, ears perked, eyes scanning the surroundings. It wasn't the usual unease of a dog responding to environmental stimuli. It was as if he knew something was coming, something bad. His presence beside Sarah had always been a comfort, but now even he seemed on edge. She found herself walking faster, the once leisurely strolls through the neighborhood now feeling like a race against time. Then the notes started. The first one appeared on Sarah's front porch one morning, an innocuous-looking envelope with no return address. Sarah opened it, expecting the simple HOA newsletter or an announcement about neighborhood cleanups. Instead, the note was typed in harsh, bold letters. "Your dog doesn't belong here. Remove it, or we will escalate." Her stomach dropped. Karen had sent the note. She was sure of it. The handwriting was too neat, too deliberate, to be anyone else's. Sarah crumpled the paper in her hand, the anger bubbling up from deep within her, but she pushed it down. She wasn't going to let this woman get the best of her, not without a fight. The following day, Sarah found another note. This one was taped to her front door, accompanied by a flyer from the HOA. The flyer stated that all dogs over 20 pounds were prohibited, a direct contradiction to the conversation she'd had with Karen just days before. At the bottom of the flyer, someone had scrawled, "Violation pending. Your dog is a danger." This time, Sarah didn't bother with the subtle approach. She was done playing nice. The situation had gone from petty annoyance to outright harassment. She reached out to her VA caseworker, explaining what was happening. Her caseworker had been a rock during her transition from military life, always supporting her and understanding the delicate balance Sarah had to maintain to stay healthy. She agreed to help escalate the situation, contacting the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division about Karen's actions. Sarah knew this was the right step, but part of her hesitated. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to become the center of neighborhood gossip. But the more Karen pushed, the more Sarah realized that this wasn't just about Max. It was about something bigger, about taking a stand against cruelty and ignorance, about proving that she wouldn't be silenced. Max stood by her side, his warm, steady presence a reminder that she wasn't in this alone. She wasn't just a woman with a service dog. She was a veteran. And that made all the difference. Then, as if on cue, the most sinister warning yet arrived. Sarah found a puddle of bleach on the sidewalk where she usually walked with Max. It was just enough to scare him off, just enough to make her feel the cold grip of fear creeping up her spine. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Karen had crossed a line, and now Sarah was going to make sure she paid the price. The quiet suburban neighborhood was no longer just a place to call home. It had become a battlefield. And Sarah wasn't going to back down. Not this time. It was a bright Saturday morning when everything finally came to a head. Sarah had just finished her morning routine, an early cup of coffee, a check on Max's gear, and a moment of peace before the inevitable storm. She slipped into her sneakers, the familiar weight of her military training settling into her muscles. Max was already by the door, his harness on, and his eyes full of purpose. It was time for their usual walk. The neighborhood, once a haven of tranquility, now felt like a war zone. Every step Sarah took, every corner they rounded, felt charged with tension. Karen's presence hung in the air like smoke, suffocating, unseen. Sarah had noticed the subtle shifts, windows that snapped shut when she passed, the murmur of voices just out of earshot. She'd been in enough hostile environments to know that people weren't just whispering anymore. They were plotting. Max walked by her side, his steps measured and calm, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his movements. His tail swished low, his eyes darting to every shadow. Something was off. Sarah could feel it too, that prickle at the back of her neck, the feeling that something was about to happen, and it wouldn't be good. As they reached the corner of the cul-de-sac near the HOA clubhouse, Sarah's instincts screamed, "Don't go any further." But it was too late. Karen appeared from behind the row of bushes by the clubhouse, her face twisted into a grimace of smug satisfaction. She stood with her phone in one hand, poised and ready, like a predator about to strike. "Is that your service dog?" Karen sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. Max, ever the professional, stood still, his eyes meeting Karen's with an unnerving calm. But Sarah could see it, the tiny tremor in his stance, the sharpness in his gaze. He knew what was coming. "I've already told you," Sarah said, her voice steady but thick with barely contained fury. "Max is a service dog. He's under federal protection." Karen ignored her, her eyes never leaving the dog. "I'm calling animal control," she spat, her finger raised in accusation. "Your dog is a threat to this neighborhood. I'm not letting this go." Before Sarah could respond, Karen lunged forward, her arm swinging violently at Max. In one swift, unexpected motion, She knocked into him with the force of a shove, and Max let out a surprised bark. Sarah felt the weight of the assault hit her chest before her mind could fully process it. The next instant, Karen shoved Sarah with all her might, sending her stumbling backward into a pile of bushes at the edge of the sidewalk. The world seemed to freeze for a moment, the sound of birds chirping replaced by a rushing in Sarah's ears. Max was barking furiously now, circling, his protective instincts kicking in. He didn't bite, but he didn't need to. The moment Karen touched him, she had crossed a line. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. What the hell just happened? Max's growls filled the air, but he didn't lunge. He was too well-trained, too controlled. But his body was poised, his muscles coiled. Sarah scrambled to her feet, fury coursing through her veins. She reached for her phone in her pocket, quickly pulling it out and hitting record. Karen, sensing the shift, turned to run, probably thinking she could escape unscathed. But Sarah wasn't going to let her get away with this. The footage was clear. The shove. The attack on Max. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was assault. And Sarah was done playing nice. "Stay right there, Karen," Sarah shouted, her voice sharp, commanding. "You're not going anywhere." But Karen didn't stop. She spun on her heel, bolting toward her house, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of the street with Max beside her, still barking. The damage had been done. The video had captured everything. Sarah's pulse raced as she looked at Max, her voice low but certain. "We're not backing down this time, boy." As Karen disappeared into her house, Sarah dialed the number she had been dreading, and now knew she had to make. The quiet neighborhood was about to be rocked by more than just complaints and petty fights. This time, Sarah was bringing the fight to Karen's doorstep. And she wasn't alone. The sound of sirens echoed through Maplewood Oaks later that afternoon, a sharp contrast to the eerie stillness that had settled in the aftermath of the confrontation. Sarah stood on her front porch, her eyes focused on the quiet street ahead, as if waiting for something, or someone, to break the tension. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes, too, remained alert, scanning the horizon. The video footage had been uploaded, sent directly to her attorney, to her veterans advocate, and to the Department of Justice. Sarah had done her homework, pulling every string she could to ensure that this time, Karen wouldn't get away with her cruelty. But in the moments between sending the footage and waiting for a response, the silence felt almost suffocating. What had she done? Had she set something in motion that couldn't be stopped? A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. Sarah's hand hovered over the handle, but she didn't open it right away. She wasn't sure if she was prepared for the consequences of her own actions. But when she peeked through the peephole, she saw a familiar face, her veterans advocate, Steve, standing with a serious expression. It was time to find out what had been set into motion. She opened the door quickly, stepping back to allow Steve inside. Max, ever the watchdog, gave a low, cautious growl, but settled when he saw that the visitor wasn't a threat. "I'm guessing you didn't come to check on my landscaping," Sarah said, trying to break the tension in the air with a wry smile. Steve gave a half smile, but didn't waste any time. "We got news. Big news." He pulled out a thick envelope from under his arm and handed it to Sarah. The seal on the envelope was unmistakable. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. She felt her heart race as she opened it, her fingers trembling slightly. The letter inside confirmed what she had feared, but also what she had hoped for. A formal investigation had been opened into the actions of Karen Mitchell and the Maplewood Oaks HOA, citing multiple violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act and federal civil rights protections. Sarah read through the details quickly, her mind spinning. The investigation wasn't just about Karen. It was about the entire HOA, its discriminatory practices, and the documented history of harassment against disabled residents. The evidence was mounting, and for the first time, it felt like the weight of the law was shifting in her favor. Steve watched her closely, his voice quiet but urgent. "The feds are on this now, Sarah. They'll be here soon, any day now. This is bigger than just you. This could change the entire HOA system in Maplewood Oaks. For a moment, the reality of it all hit her. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It wasn't even just about Karen. This was a fight for every person who had been discriminated against in silence. A fight for the rights of disabled people to live freely in a world that had too often tried to shut them out. But there was still a nagging feeling deep in Sarah's gut. She had taken a bold step, but Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. Sarah could already imagine her next move. She was likely frantic, trying to cover her tracks, scrambling to find a way to retaliate. And the thought sent a chill through Sarah's spine. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw an alert from her security system. Motion detected in your driveway. Her breath caught in her throat. Steve followed her gaze, reading the same alarm on her face. What is it? Sarah's voice was low, the tension already thick in her chest. Karen, she's coming for me. Max's ears perked up, his hackles rising. Sarah grabbed his leash, her pulse quickening. We need to get to the camera feed now. She fumbled with the controls, pulling up the live footage on her phone. What she saw made her blood run cold. In the driveway, standing in front of Sarah's car, was Karen, but she wasn't alone. 3 figures stood around her, shadowy, unfamiliar, their faces hidden in the dark. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was something far worse. They're here, Sarah whispered, and they're not playing by the rules. A rush of adrenaline surged through her as she grabbed Max's leash and moved to the door. She wasn't just waiting for the storm anymore. It had arrived. And now, it was time to face it head-on. Sarah's breath hitched as the dark figures loomed near her driveway. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and rage boiling within her veins. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just a petty neighbor dispute anymore. These weren't simple threats anymore. Karen had escalated things, and now she had brought others into the fold. Stay close, Sarah muttered to Max, who stood stock still by her side. His ears pinned back, his eyes locked on the figures ahead. His growl was low, a warning that only Sarah could hear. He was ready for whatever came next, but Sarah's mind raced, weighing her options. She could call the police, but what if they were already too late? What if Karen's puppets were there for something far darker than harassment? The figures remained motionless, their faces shrouded in shadows, but Sarah's sharp eyes caught the faint glint of metal in their hands. It was unmistakable, a crowbar, a pipe, something just out of reach of the camera's view. This wasn't just intimidation. This was an ambush. Max's stance stiffened, his tail still, but ready to lunge at the first sign of aggression. Sarah pulled him closer, but she didn't retreat. She was done running from fear. This was her home, and she was not about to let Karen and her cronies take that from her. Before Sarah could make a decision, the doorbell rang, a shrill, cutting sound that made her flinch. She turned sharply toward the door, her body instinctively tensing. She had to act fast. "Stay here, Max," she whispered, though she knew he wouldn't move without her. Sarah reached for her phone again, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number for animal control. They needed to hear this. They needed to know what was happening on her property, that it wasn't just a dispute, it was a calculated threat. The phone rang, and rang. No answer. A voice from outside broke through her thoughts. "Sarah, open the door. We need to talk." It was Karen's voice, sharply commanding, full of that same arrogance that Sarah had grown to despise. The door creaked open just enough for Sarah to see her, standing there with an expression twisted in triumph. But Karen wasn't alone. The 2 figures at her side were now more visible, and Sarah's gut twisted in disgust. They were the same people she had seen earlier by her driveway. 2 men, hulking and menacing, one holding a crowbar, the other clutching the heavy pipe. "This is your last warning." Karen's voice was tight, barely controlled. "You and your dog, you'll leave this neighborhood, or we'll make sure of it." Sarah didn't move. She stood in the doorway, her eyes locked on Karen. The scene unfolding before her had all the markings of a threat. But there was one thing Karen had failed to understand. Sarah wasn't afraid of her. Max growled again, his teeth showing now. The sound sent a chill down Sarah's spine. But it wasn't fear, it was clarity. This wasn't just about Karen trying to make her leave. This was about someone who couldn't stand losing control, someone willing to take it too far to protect her so-called perfect neighborhood. The man with the crowbar stepped forward, a glint of malice in his eyes. "Move the dog, lady, or things are gonna get real messy." Sarah's fingers tightened around her phone. The seconds felt like hours. The decision was made. This wasn't the moment to back down. This was the moment to stand tall. She raised her voice, unwavering, the authority of years in the military sharp in every syllable. "You need to leave. Now." Max barked once, a deep, forceful sound that echoed across the street. Sarah's hand shot out, pressing the emergency button on her phone. It would send a distress signal to her contacts. Steve, animal control, and the authorities. It was time for the cavalry to arrive. But it wasn't just about the authorities anymore. Sarah was done with the waiting game. "Do you know who I am?" Sarah said, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know who you're messing with? I'm not some scared woman you can push around. This is my home, my life. And if you think for 1 second that you can come here and threaten me, or my service dog, then you're making the biggest mistake of your life." For the first time, Karen hesitated. The men beside her looked to her for direction, their grip tightening on their weapons. And just like that, everything changed. Max let out a final warning growl, louder this time, more menacing. The message was clear: back off. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of sirens split the air. Blue and red lights flashed at the end of the street. It was over. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The sirens blared louder, and in the distance, Sarah could see the flashing lights cutting through the quiet street. The figures in her driveway hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance by the sudden arrival of law enforcement. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. Karen had pushed them too far, and now there was no turning back. Max's growl deepened, low and primal, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Sarah could feel the tension building like a powder keg ready to explode. For a moment, she thought about backing away, retreating inside, calling the authorities. But then she remembered why she was standing here in the first place. She wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. "You can't run, Karen," Sarah said coldly, her voice steady, but with an edge of determination. "The law is already on its way." Karen's face twisted with frustration, her eyes flicking nervously from Sarah to the advancing sirens. She took a step back, but the two men beside her didn't budge. Their grips on their weapons tightened, and Sarah could see the flicker of indecision in their eyes. It was clear they hadn't expected things to escalate this far. "Don't just stand there," Karen snapped at them, her voice cracking. "You know what to do." But Sarah wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. Before Karen could issue another command, Sarah took a deliberate step forward, placing herself between Max and the intruders. She didn't need to raise her voice this time. Her stance, resolute and unyielding, spoke volumes. Max mirrored her movements, positioning himself to protect her. His hackles raised and teeth bared in a warning that left no room for negotiation. The two men exchanged a glance, each calculating the risk of crossing the line they had already crossed. The tension crackled between them like static in the air. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man, stepped forward, brandishing the crowbar with a menacing gleam in his eyes. He was clearly the one most willing to escalate things further. But then, the sharp screech of tires cut through the air. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The cavalry had arrived. The first police car screeched to a halt at the edge of the driveway, followed by another. A third arrived seconds later. Officers poured out of the cars, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters as they assessed the scene. Sarah didn't need to explain. The atmosphere spoke for itself. "Step away from the woman and the dog," one officer shouted, his hand raised, aiming directly at the men. "Now." Max growled again, a deep guttural sound that made the men freeze. His instinct to protect Sarah was fierce, unrelenting. The officers, taking note of the situation, immediately moved to surround the group. Karen's face turned pale as the officers advanced, but she wasn't done yet. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she screeched. "I can have you all fired. This is my neighborhood. You can't do this." But it was too late. The officers weren't listening to her anymore. They'd seen the video. They'd heard the threats. Karen's days of holding power over Sarah were over. The taller man with the crowbar looked between the officers and the growing circle of tension around him. He was a bully, used to intimidation. But now, in the face of real authority, his bravado began to falter. The other man with the pipe didn't say a word. He just took a step back, his eyes widening as the officers closed in. "You're under arrest for assault, harassment, and threatening a service animal," one of the officers said firmly, his voice cold and commanding. The words landed with the weight of a hammer. Sarah stood still, her chest tight with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The situation had shifted so quickly, and for the first time, it felt like things were finally going her way. Max's growl softened into a low whine, as if sensing the tension was dissipating. Karen opened her mouth to protest again, but another officer was already on her, handcuffing her as she sputtered in outrage. "You don't understand," Karen shouted, her voice cracking under the pressure. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." But Sarah didn't flinch. She held her ground, watching as the officers cuffed Karen and escorted her to one of the police cars. The tall man was next, followed by the man with the pipe. The storm that had been brewing for weeks, the harassment, the threats, finally, it was over. Max padded over to Sarah's side, his head low but his posture relaxed. She bent down, giving him a gentle pat on the head. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice a little shakier than she wanted it to be. One of the officers approached Sarah, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "You did the right thing by calling us in. This is over now. You're safe." Sarah gave a tight nod, but her mind was still racing. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in. She had just gone head-to-head with a woman who had tried to tear apart everything Sarah had worked for. But the storm was far from over. Karen's supporters were still out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike at any moment. But for now, Sarah could breathe. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the fight was worth it. The fight wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had been silenced. It wasn't over, but she had won this round. And the next time, she would be ready. The officers continued to move methodically, processing the scene as Karen and her associates were led away in handcuffs. The sirens finally died down, leaving behind a heavy silence that clung to the air, almost oppressive. Sarah stood in the middle of her front yard, the weight of everything still pressing on her chest, but a feeling of cautious victory slowly began to seep in. She had faced her fears, and for once, it had paid off. But as much as she tried to relax, there was an unsettling thought that lingered in the back of her mind. Karen wouldn't be the last person to target her. There were always people like Karen, people who thought their power could never be challenged, people who would do anything to maintain control. Sarah had seen it before, in her years of military service and the fights she'd witnessed on the front lines. Power could corrupt, and corruption always bred more threats. The officers finished up with the men, and one of them, a tall woman with sharp, calculating eyes, walked over to Sarah. "Everything's under control, but we need to talk," she said, her tone businesslike yet not unkind. Sarah nodded, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. "What's going to happen to them?" "They'll be held for questioning," the officer replied. "The charges are serious: assault, threats, and conspiracy to intimidate. The evidence against them is solid, including the video footage you provided." Karen's already been flagged for past complaints about discriminatory behavior in the neighborhood. This won't be the last time we deal with her, but at least now, she's facing real consequences. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. So, what happens now? The officer hesitated for a moment before speaking again. The investigation is just starting. But I can assure you, this will go as far as it needs to. You've got the law on your side now, Sarah. And you've got us. You won't have to fight this battle alone. But Sarah's mind wasn't entirely at ease. What about the rest of the HOA? She asked. What if this isn't over? What if they come after me again? The officer's expression softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of understanding. We'll make sure you're protected. And if any of them try to retaliate, we'll be right there, ready to handle it. Max, still by her side, gave a soft whine, his body relaxing, as if sensing the tension was finally starting to break. Sarah knelt down, brushing her fingers through his fur. "Good boy," she whispered, giving him a quick kiss on the top of his head. But even as she stood there, feeling the warmth of Max by her side, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done with her. The woman's words had been full of threats, full of venom, and Sarah knew that people like her didn't just give up. They struck from the shadows, they dug in their heels, and they never stopped until they got what they wanted. Just as she started to turn back toward the house, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, a frown forming as she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Steve, her advocate. "We need to talk. There's something you need to know." Her stomach dropped. Not again, she thought, a cold sweat forming at the back of her neck. "Everything okay?" the officer asked, noticing the shift in Sarah's expression. Sarah forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Just another message from Steve. "I'll be fine." But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the road. Something bigger was coming, something that would test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. But this time, she wouldn't face it alone. She had Max, she had the support of the law, and she had the resolve to fight back. Karen might have thought she'd won once, but now Sarah had the upper hand, and with everything she had, she was ready for whatever came next. The fight for her home was far from over, but Sarah was more prepared than ever. The stakes had changed, and she was no longer just a woman defending herself. She was a force to be reckoned with. And no one, not even the darkest corners of Karen's schemes, would ever silence her again.